Okay. Good morning. Today is Wednesday, March 31st, and it's 8:32 a.m. This is a meeting set in Natural Resources and Energy, and we are following up. We started a conversation last week. It was a rich enough conversation that we ran out of time. So I appreciate that everyone who we couldn't hear from last week came back, and now we'll have the luxury of not having to rush through important testimony. The conversation we started last week was around S119, an act relating to establishing a community energy program. And I had sent off to all our guests a list of questions, and I just characterize them as two things. One, we didn't want to focus too narrowly on S119 as just a bill, like that we're not just vetting the bill. There's a bigger conversation that we'd like to have with our witnesses, and that is around how are we defining Vermont's challenge in terms of renewable energy generation, and what is some of the things, what are some of the options in front of us, and how are different parties looking at the best path forward? What's the balance between utilities doing projects themselves, or either their own projects or putting out bids for power purchase agreements, what the role of developers, in-state versus out-of-state generation. There's where I think maybe at a bit of a pivot point. And so we want to check in with people who are looking at developing more renewable energy in a more cost-effective way. I'd say that was, that's maybe the heart of 119. Is everyone's interested in renewable generation, and people are. The other criteria we're always facing is how do we do it in the most cost-effective and environmentally friendly way. So we're looking to hear from people who are active in the field, and as we chart a path forward. So sorry for the long preamble. Some people may not have been at last week's testimony. And with that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Bender. Good morning, and thank you again for coming back.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify. So you see my slides now?
Yes.
Yeah. So my name's Bill Bender from Norwich, Vermont. I wear three hats here. First, I grew up in Rutland, so I tend to be blunt and honest, and I'll attribute that to my Vermont upbringing. Second, president and founder of SOLAFLECT Energy, which is a backyard solar company based also in Norwich, Vermont. And finally, I also have a DPhil in economics. I worked internationally for more than a decade, and really my whole career on data analysis, and more than a decade I worked internationally in economic policy, and very much related to poverty and income inequality issues. Okay, so now my screen is not letting me move forward here. So I'm going to try this again. Apologies for this.
No worries. We're really used to the electronics helping us, and once in a while tripping us up a little.
Okay, that.
Okay, we can see it again.
Okay, so I think we all agree here that there's a global climate emergency. The place where I think we might disagree a little bit is I'm going to argue that Vermont is actually failing, even in the electrical sector, in dealing with the climate emergency. That's not a popular opinion in Vermont, I understand. So first I'm going to start with a screenshot from the Green Mountain Power website. So this looks great, nice pictures of windmills and solar farms. We look up, they say 94% carbon free. That sounds fantastic. 63% renewable. All good. You know, the difference there, of course, is nuclear, but I'm good with that. But if you also look in more detail on their energy mix, it's 2.2% is solar. They have a nice picture of it. So there must be a lot of wind. Their energy mix is actually 0.0% wind. The wind we do have in Vermont is all exported effectively to Massachusetts and Connecticut. So is Vermont's electricity really green? Well, it depends upon who you ask. If you ask Google, Apple, Green Need Energy, the nation's leading independent certifier of renewable energy, or the 5 other New England states, they'll all say no, where most of the Vermont bureaucracy will say yes. So why is that? Well, it's really all around additionality, and additionality is fundamental to the Paris Climate Agreement. So Google states, we seek to purchase energy only from newly constructed generation facilities or expansion of existing projects, rather than simply redirecting renewable energy outputs from pre-existing projects. Why is that? It's because that's the only thing that will actually change the climate. Apple says we prioritize the creation of renewable energy instead of taking away from existing renewable energy available to others. Why is that? Because it's the only thing that will actually address climate change. Green E, again, the largest certifier of renewable energy, only certifies projects built within 15 years. Why is that? It's because additionality. It's the only thing that actually changes the climate. And finally, the 5 other New England states do not recognize large hydro the same way that Vermont does. Vermont is unique. Where most of the Vermont bureaucracy says we're good. So let's actually look at some of the data. So this is data presented by Agency of Natural Resources to the Vermont Climate Council. My understanding is it's been forwarded to the legislature, so you might have all seen this. If you look at the far right column under 2018, you'll see this is millions of metric tons of carbon emissions, is this table. And in the far right column, we can see transportation and heating look like the big numbers. So that's what we should be concerned about, of course, right? But let's look at electricity for a minute. So it looks like we're doing a good job here. So we went from the middle of the decade, we're roughly 1 million metric tons of carbon emissions, of CO2 emissions. And then we had this big reduction. Look, from 2016, we went from 0.81 to 2018, we went to 0.19 million metric tons of emissions. So that looks fantastic, a 75% reduction in emissions in 2 years. Oh, this sounds great. So how did that happen? So 0.62 million metric tons is 620,000 metric tons. So where did that 620,000 metric tons go? Well, we could have built 1.5 gigawatts of solar, 5 times more than everything we've ever built before. I'm in the solar industry. I really missed out on that building opportunity. It didn't happen, right? Or it would be equivalent to taking 1/3 of all our cars in Vermont off the road. So did I miss something? Is there actually a massive junkyard in the middle of Lake Champlain where 200,000 cars got trashed? I don't think so. So nothing actually changed. If you were floating around in the atmosphere and we're measuring the carbon coming up, there's no reduction. That 620,000 metric tons is a mirage. Now, again, remember, I'm an economist, and in economics, we're used to thinking of 2 parts of the economy. There's the real economy, which is goods and services, which provide for the welfare of people, and there's a financial and monetary economy. And those 2, of course, are linked. And what happens in the paper economy affects the real economy, but we're really used to separating the 2. And here we have a paper economy that is fundamentally getting used here to make us look like we're doing a really good job in the electric sector. But if you actually think about the real flows of carbon, and I've challenged ANR and nobody can come up with any kind of answer, because is there any way you can show that we actually, somewhere in the northeastern US?
Mr. Chair.
Senator McDonald.
I believe that the witness is correct, that we have our carbon reduction has plateaued and we're not moving forward. And I admire his research and putting that evidence together. We need to know, what would he recommend that we do next and to overcome our barriers, which are, some political pushback and whatever. We need to know what to do next. I think we believe and understand that carbon emissions have plateaued and we need to bring them down.
Well, okay, thank you. But I would invite Mr. Bender to keep on going, because I did ask people for context. And
I'm not, this is, Mr. Chair, this is no connection of, I have participated here during Zoom like many other senators and listened to very knowledgeable people. And at the end of their testimony, it's time for lunch. And then we come back and do it again the next day. We need help in being given advice on how to move forward on the problem, not hear about it from well-educated, organized presenters who we need to know what to do next, not have us be told over and over again what the problem is that we know that we're trying to tackle. And this is unfair to the witness, and I apologize to the witness. It's our problem that we have to deal with.
Well, okay.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Senator McCormick.
Thank you. There are times when I think that Senator McDonald may be my only friend, and I hate disagreeing with him. But in this case, I think this witness has prepared a presentation, and I would like to hear it as he prepared it.
When do we?
I'm sorry,
yes,
Mark.
I would too.
We got to hear it.
I would too. So I'm quiet now. But
thank you.
Right, and I will try to address exactly your concern, Senator McDonald. But I do think the data does matter.
Yes. So my own background is in the sciences, so data counts, and I'll ask for everyone's patience, because some of what Mr. Bender's offering is contrary to sort of received wisdom circulating in Vermont. So I think it behooves us to understand it. So we'll do our best to hold our horses and keep on going. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks very much. So my argument is really that the data does matter. And again, it goes back to economics. What happens on the monetary side does affect what happens in the real side. And so the data does actually affect our decisions. So we'll go back again. This is also from the Green Mountain Power website. So this is the behind that previous graph or screenshot I showed you, the energy mix. So we have 30% nuclear. That's great. It's a pre-existing resource. It's good to use. We're 2.2% solar. Wind doesn't show up in here because we sell it all out of state. And nearly 62% of everything is hydro. Now, that hydro is almost exclusively 20th century facilities. So it's either hydro in New England and New York, which is all 20th century facilities, some of that dating back to 1880, or it's Hydro Quebec, which the average age is 40 years, and 85% of everything up there is 20th century facilities. Nuclear and hydro do not address climate change. If we could build more nuclear or build new hydro, that would, but there's almost no scope for doing that. We've dammed virtually all the rivers in northeastern North America. The only thing that's actually going to change the climate is to build new renewables. Efficiency is great, but we can't efficiency to zero, and we have to electrify, which is going to overwhelm the efficiency improvements we can make. So we need to build solar and wind renewables. We're not going to be building new nuclear plants in the next 10 years, and there's very little scope for additional hydro. A little bit in Hydro Quebec, but it's very small in comparison to what we're using. And it's good to remember that Hydro Quebec actually floods more forest than all of Vermont. These dams are massive up there. And any new dams, when you're flooding forests like that, a lot of the carbon benefits are delayed for 10, 20 years, which is the time frame we're really worried about. So it's really a deception. In a high level economics, we use a simple thing called sniff test. If it smells bad, it probably is bad. To me, this smells bad, and we need to think differently about the data. Now, what got brought up again and again and again, it was brought up Friday, so I changed this a little bit since Friday, so thank you for that opportunity. But I'm going to directly address the cost shift argument. First of all, understand where it came from. Came straight out of the Koch brothers funding. There's not, for a lot of Vermont, that's not a good thing. It goes back to at least 2011 in some of their front groups that are saying the cost shift argument was specifically designed to support fossil fuel production over renewables. And where's the real cost shift? The real cost shift is shifting onto the planet. Like if we shirk our responsibility for doing something about the climate, we're just destroying the biosphere. So back to economics. This is my economics hat on. So economics is about goods and services, providing goods and services to a broad swath of consumers, and it's really about consumer welfare. Consumers are always the starting point in economics. That's ultimately what you're trying to do, is how do you provide goods and services to individuals and promote their welfare. So let's look at two different perspectives here. In Vermont, when we're talking about electricity, we're often talking about the monopoly utility perspective, and that's the cost shift, is the monopoly utility perspective. So they have a regulated profit cost shift from the adopters to the non-adopters. It's an expensive resource compared to other alternatives. There's no real social benefit maybe to some of these new technologies, and regulators work very closely with the monopolies. But you put on the consumer hat, and sometimes new technologies have extra services. There's more versatility. There's something about ownership and control that consumers like. Sometimes consumers just plain prefer the new technology. And consumers fundamentally want consumer choice. So you understand the technology I'm talking about here, right? I'm talking about phones, of course. So landlines were a monopoly utility, right? And then cell phones came along and offered something that consumers wanted. We still have both, but clearly cell phones is a fundamentally different technology and provides different services to consumers. And if we had the Vermont PUC trying to regulate the landlines, we'd still all be using landlines. So back to, again, economics. What do consumers want? Well, certainly with the vast majority of our customers, reducing their carbon footprint is one of their main reasons that they want to go solar. They're interested in saving the planet. And when someone installs one of our backyard trackers, they are reducing the amount of carbon entering the atmosphere. Because think about what happens. Does the nuclear plant, if we put on a new solar system, does the nuclear plant turn itself down? And the answer is no. Does the hydro system turn itself down? And the answer is no. Those things have been producing the same amount of power. There's exogenous factors that control when they go up and down, but it's not the amount of power produced. What's turning down is a natural gas plant. So that is directly contributing to a reduction in climate change. Vermonters also are concerned about the investment return. They want to invest in an energy source that will provide them 20, 25 years of power. And there's an investment return. We support home ownership. Why would we not support solar ownership? From a consumer perspective, it's the same kind of thing. Vermonters also want on-site energy production. Did anyone see what happened in Texas? Obviously there was a small number of people there that had solar systems and batteries, and the lights stayed on. And Hurricane Irene, we want resilience. Do we remember the toilet paper running out? Do we see in the last couple of weeks the danger of single choke points? Do we really want all our energy coming from offshore wind and from Hydro-Quebec? There's a different level of resilience when people can own and control their own power, and also just plain different resources under different control, different vendors. Cybersecurity risks are real and growing. And so a diversity has resilience benefits. And finally, renters and low-income Vermonters want the same thing, and that's through community solar. So at SOLAFLECT Energy for 4 years, we built a community solar field every year until Vermont finally made it not really feasible anymore a few years ago. And we had many more low-income customers and renters that participated in that. We could kind of work with virtually everybody in the state. But without community solar, we definitely lose some of those lower income people. So again, what happens when you have a more diverse economy? So we did a survey last summer of our customers, and we compared their rate of adoption of technologies to the state average. So our customers are adopting batteries 10 times more faster than the average Vermonter. They're adopting EVs 10 times faster than the average Vermonter. They're adopting heat pumps 10 times faster than the average Vermonter. Why is this? Well, we can't take 100% of the credit, but we take a lot of the credit because we stay very close to our customers, because a lot of our business comes from referrals from existing customers that are happy. And also when they adopt some of these other technologies, sometimes they want some more solar. So there's to electrify our economy, staying close, the renewable energy industry, staying close to the customers is a really important piece of that. And there's not some simple things there. When you get an EV, you probably have to do some house wiring. When you get a heat pump, you may have to switch out your electrical panel. If you do those things when you put in the solar, you get a 26% tax credit right now. So the customers that are adopting those things are planning ahead for electrification, and they're actually getting that tax credit for some of that electrical work they have to do inside their house. So the Department of Public Service, and these are some of their numbers, and I honestly don't agree with a lot of their numbers about net metering. And I certainly don't agree with some of their economic analysis that some of the non-economists in the Department of Public Service are putting out. But I'm taking these numbers for face value. So this is for 20 megawatts of net metering. Their numbers would add 0.22% to a customer's bill, which comes out to 24 cents on the average monthly Vermont electric bill. So we can compare this to the exact same electric bill. On average, we already have a $6.72 energy efficiency charge on that bill, which we've had for a lot of years, and we think is having meaningful results. So the comparison is a very small impact, even if the Department of Public Service is correct. So we really have two options, and I know net metering is a really controversial concept, or you've heard way too much about it over the years. But again, think of it from an economic perspective. Almost all the conversations you have are from the utility perspective, that it's a source of energy that's no different than buying an offshore wind farm or buying something from Hydro-Quebec. Now think of it instead from a consumer's perspective. And this actually happened to me. My next door neighbor, after I put in solar, said, "Hey, is there any way I can get some of your excess?" And so, sure, I could run a power line over to his house and give him my extra power, right? Except that's entirely illegal, because then I'd be a utility. I can't do that. So that is actually a constraint on what an option is. So suppose I just want to share it over the power line, send it 100 yards down the road to him. Well, the marginal cost of that almost 99.99% of the time is zero, right? So then the other thing I might say, well, what if I want to just save it for a couple hours? Well, again, if you look at the marginal cost of doing that, if a consumer wanted that grid service, the marginal cost of that is really, really low, right? And even possibly I want to save that energy for a few months. Well, there might be a penny or something for that. So when we think about it from a consumer's perspective, it just is fundamentally different. And I'll come back to that in just a second, but this is sort of a list, and back to Senator McCormick's questions in terms of what should we do right now. The first thing is to get the data correct. Like we have to, if the data, and we can follow this protocol and that protocol, and there's nothing easy about it, for sure. But what is really clear is if the numbers are showing that we reduced 620,000 metric tons of carbon, and nobody can find anywhere in northeastern North America where that carbon got reduced, then that's not data we should be basing our policy on. And maybe we have to do that to check some box, but if we do, then we should have another set of data that we base our policy on. We actually have to reduce carbon flows. So we need numbers that reflect reality. The second thing is, why doesn't a Vermonter have a right to have solar? Why is this any more than, say, a garden? So again, growing up in Vermont, homegrown tomatoes, or do some of you know the homegrown tomato song? We even have songs about it in Vermont, right? A lot of people have a garden. People have a cut firewood in the back lot. So we generally think that's a good thing. But why starting in September, if we have a backyard solar, which is exactly what we do, we put it in the backyard right beside the garden, why is there a 34% charge on that starting in September to have your own energy source, even if you consume it on site? And we talked a lot about storage on Friday as well. And this is actually penalizing people that can put storage on their own system. So if you have a house, you can have solar, you have storage, you still have to pay 34% on that power that you use in your own home. Do we want to charge 34% for growing tomatoes in your backyard, or for canning tomatoes in your backyard, or cutting your own firewood? It just doesn't really make sense. It's certainly not the Vermont I grew up in. And why does this happen? Well, it started with the solar production meter, which was initially put in so that you could provide an incentive to solar. You had a 6-cent incentive for solar, so you put in a production meter. But now that production meter is being used to actually penalize behind the meter solar in a residential or business situation. It's not required in most other states, but in Vermont now, it's actually there's a negative adders on that, so you're actually charged even if it never goes into the grid. So, and why do we want to say you can only have 100 square feet for your garden, or only half an acre for your garden? You know, you can only have 3 tomato plants. Like, why do we have a constraint on how much solar you can have in your backyard? Now, once it enters the grid, yes, there's some other issues after we enter the grid, but we're talking about before it even enters the grid, why are we constraining it? So what's really happening is this is not a cost shift, there's competition. Okay, so we've had 100-year-old monopolies. They don't like competition. It would be great if you want to legislate that SOLAFLECT Energy is the only solar company in Vermont. I'd be happy with that, but you know, it's not good economic policy, right? So there's some competition here. There is a real issue, and what's behind the issue we're talking about is utilities lose revenue. Okay, so let's just be honest here. It's not a cost shift. It's a loss of revenue. And if grids have certain services, they have fixed costs, and so that's a real issue. Granted. So, but the thing is with the climate issue, we have a big opportunity, and the opportunity is that 82% of Vermont's energy comes from fossil fuels, non-electric. We have to electrify that 82% of the Vermont economy. If we electrify that sufficiently fast, we can replace the revenue. And if we replace the revenue, then the main concerns of the utilities is going to disappear. So it's a race here of, can we replace the revenue fast enough so that we can still maintain the grid the way we want it? And that's the real issue, the way we should focus on it. But we do need to still think about the climate. It's if 2020, if we didn't see that, the climate is telling us loud and clear that we have a big problem. So the only solution is efficiency and building solar and wind. Those are the only ways the climate's going to change. There's nothing else. So we currently have a goal for 10% renewable. We should accelerate that. So we should hit that goal in the next 3 years. And then we should double that to 20% over the longer term. And net metering is, sure, you can change some charges, but if we're going to change the charges, let's do it where we interact with the grid, not behind the meter. But it's in the Public Service Department spreadsheets that net metering goes to 0 in 6 years. And that makes no sense from a climate perspective whatsoever. And it's actually not what Vermonters want. Vermonters like solar. They honestly do. And it's a question of how do we maintain the utility revenue over time. Solar and EVs are really friendly. When we have a fully electrified EV fleet, we're going to have almost a week of storage in the state. That gets rid of the storage, that gets rid of the daily problem, it gets rid of most of the weekly problem. But heat pumps less so. So heat pumps is a real area where it's not great for solar, a little bit better for wind, but still that's where there's a whole lot of utility revenue to replace the lost revenue by increased solarization of customers and businesses in Vermont. And finally, community solar is absolutely critical for the lower income Vermonters and renters. They want to go solar. And community solar is one of the viable ways to do that.
Before we leave that page, or
Sure.
before we go on, can you
Well, no, that's
just say,
really the end of what I'm presenting.
can you explain the 34% in September to the committee, please?
Sure. So there's a penny site adjuster, and so a -1 cent site adjuster, a -4 cent rec adjuster. So if someone wants to truly be solar, it's another 4 cents. And then they pay the 1 cent energy efficiency charge. So there's 6 cents charge there for energy, even if it never goes into the grid, you still have to pay that out of 17 or 18 cents. So that's the 34%.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and sorry, the site adjuster, rec adjuster, and
The
what was the third?
energy efficiency charge, a penny for that.
Oh, right. Okay. Your homegrown production has to pay the energy efficiency charge.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. All right. Thanks.
So I'm open for any questions.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if. Oh, I see. Okay, we are at the end.
So, I could go on with economics for days and days, and as it was, I was tried to squeeze it into probably still a little longer than ideal. I know you have other witnesses and a lot on your plate, but the economic issues I think are critical, and honestly, I get upset with some of the level of economic analysis of some of these issues.
Sure. Well, we appreciate you, sharing that with us, because one of the sayings in the room is we don't want to engage in wishful thinking. It's like so we're very game for hearing a different point of view and a different analysis to make sure that we're not operating on received wisdom or something like that. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a little institutional memory to expand on this, the testimony we just heard about greenwashing. Our part of the misimpression that Vermont is doing better than we are is having designated Hydro-Quebec as a renewable. And I can say, because I was in the middle of it, that we never did that because we thought it was true. We did it because it's sort of like the agricultural exemption in Act 250. The votes were not there for an important energy efficiency bill unless we did that. And it was long, and of course a deal is a deal, and that was the deal we made at the time. But on the other hand, nothing is forever, and this was many years ago, and I think we probably should take a look at a more honest accounting of what we're doing. The other thing I wanted to make, people mistake Senator McDonald and me for one another all the time. Actually, Senator McCormick leapt to your defense. It was Senator McDonald who was telling you to cut to the chase. Okay, all right. Thanks. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to look back at the list we just went through, and I think some of the aspects that are definitely under the legislature's control. For instance, there was a bill last year, S267, that proposed moving the Tier 2 requirement from 10% to 20%, things along those lines. So let me just look around the room before we go on to a next witness and see if there are other questions for committee members. I mean, for Mr. Bender from committee members. Okay. In terms of, so this is your focus is, and I see it now in SOLAFLECT Energy, it says backyard solar. What's your overall analysis on the notion that well-sited larger arrays will enjoy some economies of a scale that are useful to the number that generally this committee's heard repeatedly is that 80% of people, either by virtue of being a renter or in a home that's not well sited for solar, that their way of participating in solar will be through purchasing panels or taking power off a larger array. Do you have a thought on, the economies of scale approach as opposed to the backyard approach?
Well, again, I mean, I think what is good here is consumer choice, right? And I think in the long run, both are going to be part of the solution. And honestly, the biggest issue is how do we go faster on both fronts? And from the utility perspective, it's an issue of how do we get more revenue there, which is, like I say, instead of the cost shift, it's a competition and a revenue issue, and you have fixed costs with the grid, so revenue does matter. So I acknowledge that that's a real issue there, but we've made few strides in electrifying. But electrifying is fundamentally going to happen at the home, right? And so if people have EVs, they're going to want to charge at home, they're going to want to charge at work. Those are the two places. If we're going forward, we should be thinking about with EVs, how do we charge when the sun's out? EVs by themselves bring enough capacity to allow intermittent resources. So when people start having to do some of that electrical work, these things all go together. Smart panels, solar, batteries, EVs at a house all make sense. And so that, and any serious look forward, like to 2050, of how are we going to solve the climate issue, all of them that I'm aware of, and there's several, look at decentralized grid in the future. There's going to be decentralized generation, decentralized ownership. There's going to be more types of sharing arrangements, more types of legal arrangements. There's no one that I know of that says the way forward is a monopoly utility model. You got to remember, Vermont has one of the most vertically integrated monopoly utilities in the country. A lot of states have various levels of competition or community aggregation, or the ability for towns to, take a different path. So there's a lot of experimentation on these things. But from a customer perspective, it's only the utility perspective where you say there's economies of scale and a big solar system is a lot less expensive. When consumer is paying a retail rate, they're not paying a wholesale rate. So from the consumer perspective, if they put solar on their house, they're not comparing it to a wholesale rate, they're comparing it to their retail rate. If we did not tax that behind the meter and say we did have you received less compensation when you export something than when you import it, then that in itself is also creating an incentive for more storage. So to have a slightly lower rate for exporting into the grid than importing from the grid, I could see that if we were actually being successful on our climate goals, that would make sense. Right now, where we're not being successful on our climate goals, I think the urgency is too great. We should go back to net metering and make some more forward progress on the climate. But so from that consumer perspective, it's not a wholesale rate that matters. But there certainly are a large part of Vermont that cannot have solar on site, and there community solar makes sense. From a business perspective, it would be very advantageous for us to. It was much easier for us to when we could also do community solar, when we could balance both community solar and residential solar. It made it a lot easier to schedule when you had some longer term projects to work around. Honestly, Vermont is a very challenging place to do business. When we put in backyard solar, 2/3 of those dollars stay in Vermont. So something as a 64-year resident of Vermont, I've been really proud of, because we produce 40% more power by actually pointing at the sun and moving. That technology was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, their Sunshot program. We won $2 million nationally competitive awards to develop that, which is that whole suspension structure you see in that picture right there. we use far fewer panels because we're pointing at the sun that all come from overseas. 99% of solar modules come from overseas. Instead, we use that steel superstructure, which you can see right above the family there. That steel is all manufactured in St. Johnsbury. Our electronics are manufactured in Springfield, and our machine is assembled in Norwich. And we use, excavator operators and electricians and whatever around the state. So 2/3 of those dollars stay in the state. So the one time that we've done a fixed field, I can show you, this happened to us a couple years ago in White River Junction. This was when the fossil fuels took out a solar company. We were the center of this propane. This is a propane tank explosion. Our business was totally leveled. And so that fall, we had had a permitted solar field, which we've always done with our trackers. So we built that with fixed arrays. So we hired another company to put in the racking and the modules. And I was kind of surprised that when the labor force to do that showed up, there's a guy from Nebraska, there was a guy from Colorado, there were 2 guys from South Carolina, there's a guy from New Jersey. And so this is who was working. When we hire people, they're all from either Vermont or New Hampshire, since we're based in the Upper Valley. We use all local labor, and those dollars stay here. When a family decides to put in a backyard solar system, that money is usually sitting in a mutual, either they take out a loan and we use local financial institutions, or if they have the resources, it's probably sitting in a money market fund in New York or Boston. They're bringing those dollars into Vermont, and then 2/3 of those dollars are going directly for jobs in Vermont. So it's trying to compare apples and oranges here. In the long run, you absolutely need both.
Okay. Well, I'm just checking to see if there are any other questions from the committee. Thank you very much for, did you send your slides into Ms. Newman?
I'll send in, I made some changes, and I sent in the previous presentation, and then I made some changes. So I did not send that yet. I apologize for that. I'll send that.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking there may, for myself and others, they may want to go back through the slides after. So if you could send them into June, we'll put them up on our website. So thank you very much.
Okay. And thank you for the opportunity to testify. I appreciate it very much.
Senator McDonald.
Mr. Chair, I had 3 questions, and one was, how do we make solar shine at night, and which would promote more renewables? How do we set new policies that would reduce line losses, which would stop us from which would do the obvious? And how do we get renewable energy out of where it's produced, which the policy now requires us to pay ourselves to do that. At the same time, we are being assessed to get electricity into other places, which is often fossil fuel electricity. How do we tackle those 3 barriers that would help us solve the problems that the witness has explained to us in detail and clearly explained to us? How do we tackle those 3 things? I think that's our challenge, is not to sit and look at the patient who's losing blood because he didn't negotiate the intersection correctly and tell him that he should have been a better driver. How do we put a tourniquet on this and move ahead?
So Senator McDonald, just to make sure I understand your 3 questions. The solar shining, how do we make the sun shine at night? So there's the intermittent production with renewable energy question, reduce line losses, and then I wasn't sure
by policy, not by physics.
Okay. And what was the 3rd one, please? That I didn't catch.
How do we look at the system of moving electricity, which subsidizes the movement of electricity from afar but to customers, but does not allow close by electricity to be funded to move it out of where it is to close by areas, to eliminate line losses and not to have to shut off those renewables when they're producing, because we haven't funded the way to get them to market. At the same time, the customers today are taxed or required to fund how to get electricity to customers. We can't get it out of our producer from where it's produced to nearby customers. We're funding huge power lines that send electricity into New York City that may not be renewable. So,
Mr. Bender, do you want to speak to any of those before we move on?
I think the one to really keep in mind is electric vehicles. And if you saw the Super Bowl, you saw that Chevy has made a big push. They had some great little ads attacking Norway, and then Audi Norway. Because in Norway, it's 54% of, in 2020, 54% of all vehicles sold were EVs. And you can't say it just, it's about weather, because Norway obviously has at least the winter that we have. So 54% were EVs, a quarter were hybrid, and a quarter were old-fashioned internal combustion engines, ICE engines. So that is what's happening. And so GM committed to all electric vehicles by 2035. Since then, Volvo has come out and said by 2030. So as we have more EVs, that ultimately will be essentially a week of storage in Vermont. And that week of storage is enough to save the solar from the day to the night, and even from the sunny day to the cloudy day through the couple of days of rain. So EVs and storage is something to really think about matching. I know there's some utilities have come out with EV charging rates that are cheap at night. What we really want to think about are rates that are cheap when the sun's out, right? And so, and one of the biggest barriers to adoption, and this is my economics hat again, what is one of the most important functions of states or governments? It's infrastructure. And when it comes to EVs, one of the main barriers for EVs is the charging network. So as that improves, we're going to have much higher EV adoption. As we have higher EV adoption, we're going to have more batteries on the grid. And if we actually work hard to make sure that those batteries are charged when the sun's out, that's going to solve some of the problem. And if you have charging stations, for example, at work, if people start going back to work, when the pandemic's over, then they can charge on the sunny days. And if you commute, say 30 miles a day and you have 300-mile range, you can just, if a Tuesday is sunny, you charge on Tuesday and it's enough miles for the whole week.
We know that, and we know that EVs charged at home buy electricity that would be thrown away after midnight, would be wasted and unsold. And that helps the electric companies balance their income sheets. But how do we solve the shortage of electricity between dark and when people are finished watching television and go to bed?
Yeah, well, I mean, batteries are coming fast. So we never sold batteries at all until last year. And this year now for Sonnen, which is a big German battery company, we're actually gold installers. So we're one of the larger installers already in the country. So that's changing, the situation fairly fast. The cost of batteries is coming down really dramatically.
Well, as an economist, what's the mechanism for paying for that and having it happen?
Well, for the consumers, if you charge them 34% to produce the solar and put it in the battery, we're disincenting that before anything happens, before it ever leaves their house. So, that's one of the incentives for people is that when you use instead of using a wholesale price of electricity, a consumer is comparing to a retail price of electricity. And as solar prices are coming down and battery prices are coming down, it's becoming more and more economically feasible. But charging people,
That's my question.
even if they
How do
store
you
it in a
make it
battery,
economically feasible? We know
well,
that. Yeah.
we just removed the 34% for starters. I mean, that has, made it dramatically more difficult for us this year. It's happening right now. The prices changed in February and they changed again in September. And that changes the economics pretty dramatically. 34% makes the difference between it being a financially sensible thing for an individual consumer to, more questionable.
So do we reduce the 35% for the owners of the solar who go out and get the batteries and put them in? Or do we just reduce it for everybody, whether or not they go and get a battery and put it in?
Well, that 34% is referring to all behind the meter. So yes, I would say that, what happens behind the meter is just like your garden. I don't think the state should be in the business of monitoring gardens, and we should not be in the business of monitoring someone making some cordwood.
What do we do? What policy do we change? How do we change the law to achieve what you
eliminate
eloquently described to us as the problem?
Yeah, eliminate the solar production meter. So then we have a meter at the grid, and then all the PUC policy is set at the grid edge. So then it's a question of what goes into the grid and what comes out of the grid. And so the PUC still has full latitude to make changes there, which is affecting the utility. But when we're talking about behind the meter, we can get rid of that cost shift argument. If we're charging people for what happens behind the meter, if they produce something and consume it themselves or store it themselves, that's only competition with utility. It's a revenue issue for a utility. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we've focused on a nugget here that the committee needs to understand better. But if that's the witnesses, that's the point at which change has to take place and be understood, I'm ready to learn about that. And that last bit was very helpful to me. So,
well, thank you again, Mr. Bender, for coming in. And with that, seeing no other.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. With that, I'd like to move to Mr. Farrell, who's been sitting very still the whole time.
Yes, holding my breath almost. Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to present some comments here. I did not have a chance to put a slide deck together, but I will be speaking off some prepared remarks here, Mr. Chairman, that I'd be happy to share with the committee. I might want to clean them up a little bit, but happy to share them afterwards if helpful.
Okay, sure. But especially if you have data in there, it's hard to really listen and catch the data at the same time. So thank you for that offer.
Completely understood. So I guess, first of all, I want to begin by thanking the committee for allowing me to provide these comments. I also want to recognize the challenge that the pandemic has created for the legislative community, and thank you all for your continued service during this, very challenging time. It's been challenging for folks in the private sector as well. Running a business during this time has not been easy. So my name is Chad Farrell, and I'm the founder and CEO of Encore Renewable Energy. We're based here in Vermont. We are innovators in community scale clean energy and an emerging regional leader in full service community scale renewable energy services. We're a values-led benefit corporation focused on the triple bottom line, and we specialize in reclaiming undervalued real estate for clean energy generation and storage. We've delivered over 80 community scale solar projects in Vermont, ranging from 50 kilowatts up to 5 megawatts, for a total of over 60 megawatts and over $100 million in economic activity in Vermont. We've actively worked with a number of the utilities here in the state to help support their renewable energy goals. And we're active in both the larger scale, I call it community scale. Some people call it commercial industrial scale. We prefer to call it community scale And we're also active in the burgeoning energy storage market, and that is both short duration storage as well as long duration storage. We're now active in neighboring markets in the Northeast, most notably Maine, New York, and increasingly Pennsylvania, where we're responding to positive market signals in these other jurisdictions, as Vermont has unfortunately become somewhat stagnant from a legislative and policy standpoint, as well as more difficult from a regulatory and permitting perspective. And I know that's not the focus of this discussion, but it's real. So my comments will be reflective of our position in the clean energy market, which again is more focused on larger scale projects as compared to the residential focus of Mr. Bender's company and others here in Vermont. But back to the positive. Encore is a direct result of the solid policy put forth by this committee and others. We began our clean energy journey in 2009 in response to the creation of the 50 megawatt standard offer or feed-in tariff program, which Senator McDonald referred to last week, and it absolutely is true that this was the jumpstart that the renewable energy industry in Vermont required, at least for the larger scale projects that we are engaged around. Despite working over a year to get 5 brownfield sites under control and submitted into that program, we unfortunately did not win the lottery for any of those contracts, though we did end up working with one contract winner, serving as the developer for one of those early projects. And while our standard offer experience was unfortunately limited, we did quickly realize that the recrafted virtual net metering program offered another avenue for clean energy deployment in Vermont, and thus business opportunity for Encore, as well as the many professionals and companies that support our work. In short, it was good policy at the time and has allowed many Vermont homeowners, businesses, and institutions to participate in the burgeoning clean energy economy and in fact save money while doing so. And it also caused our utilities to engage around the incorporation of distributed generation resources into our energy supply portfolios. And an example of that, we've already dealt with a number of major issues that newer markets such as Maine are just wading through now. Again, all while the climate clock continues to tick. So really good policy, but perhaps in need of an update or another tool that I'll get into. But however, back to net metering, as I think we all know, the program is limited to 500 kilowatts. And as corporate and institutional interest in renewable energy and decarbonization increases, again, like a customer-focused view, as Mr. Bender alluded to, we definitely need additional tools in the toolbox to respond to this demand. One example of this interest is the hundreds of higher education institutions across the country, including a number in Vermont, who have signed on to the American College and University President's Climate Commitment with the goal of achieving complete decarbonization by 2030. An example of this, Josh Castonguay referred to this during his testimony on Friday from GMP, is an innovative project that we're collaborating on with Green Mountain Power and Middlebury College, which could serve as a cornerstone of the college's Energy 2028 decarbonization goals. So again, it's the concept of additionality that Mr. Bender also spoke to. The college really wanted to be engaged in a project that would result in new renewable generation. And we worked collaboratively with Green Mountain Power to create a special contract, a special vehicle for that purpose outside of the net metering program. We were able to achieve the scale of a 5 megawatt solar project to drive the power purchase agreement price down to a much lower number than the net metering projects. But again, that scale really helped. We're currently engaged with a Vermont startup business called Glavel. They around the same concept. Glavel is a new Vermont business that's manufacturing subgrade material for highways and airport runways and so on and so forth. They're using recycled glass, mixing it with Glavel, and creating this aggregate material that requires heating. So they have kilns. Their differentiation amongst their competitors in the marketplace is that they are going to be the only entity that achieves that outcome or creates that aggregate material from renewable energy resources, from clean renewable energy resources. So there's another example of, both institutional as well as private sector companies really interested in securing carbon-free electricity. And then finally, Mr. Bender alluded to this as well, community solar. And by this, I'm not speaking about the community scale, but the residential subscription model for folks that either can't afford the cost of a customer-sited solar project, but also for folks who rent, may have shaded roofs or backyards, and or folks such as myself who live in more densely populated areas of the state. There's been a very strong evolution of that market over the last 5 or 6 years. There are aggregator platforms that have been established to serve this segment of the market, that will take care of sort of making sure the subscriptions to the community solar plant are maintained. And there are also numerous examples of components to other states' programs where low and moderate income folks have been, their participation has been encouraged. So really, it's great to see the bill, reflect a return to the community solar model that we did unfortunately lose a number of years ago. But now on to the bigger picture and an attempt to respond to the questions that the committee put before the witnesses for this particular round of testimony. And I've embedded a few of these questions into my remarks here, so bear with me as I read through them. So the first question that you all asked was, how would your organization define Vermont's renewable energy generation challenges? And I mentioned the difficult regulatory and permitting environment. That is definitely an issue that we're going to need to grapple with. But it's outside of the purview of this discussion. So I would say the main challenge is at present are the limited options for deployment of renewables. We have had the standard offer program over the last decade or so. It is scheduled this is the last year that it's scheduled to be operational. And it was a good program. However, it was less than 10 megawatts per year, and 10 megawatts is less than 0.2% of the state's total power usage. And you add that onto the fact that many of these projects never got built, especially under the reverse auction mechanism, where overly aggressive price points were proposed that just never could get built in an era of tariffs on solar panels, tariffs on racking, reductions in investment tax credit value, so on and so forth. So the standard offer program, was decent as a starting point, but was certainly nothing to build an economy around. The net metering program has been significantly cut back or curtailed. Some of this was due to the inclusion of preferred sites, but I would say more so due to the 500 kilowatt per customer cap. There have been, obviously, we've also been, as we've achieved a greater degree of solar on the grid and other renewables, interconnection costs have been ticking upward over the last several years. And that has happened in conjunction with a gradual lowering over the years of the net metering credit values. The combination of which is, quite frankly, causing these projects to no longer pencil. And in fact, we at Encore are no longer actively originating any net metering projects in Vermont, as the risk at this point just far outweighs the reward. In other states, there are opportunities under the PURPA Act, but those opportunities do not exist in Vermont. The 7-year contract term for PURPA contracts in Vermont is just simply not financeable. Bilateral PPAs with utilities, they've been a decent opportunity, but they are limited in scale, and they're slow to develop, and quite frankly, they're pretty risky. We're trying to achieve the lowest price points possible, and if the market moves in terms of additional tariffs or whatever, reductions in investment tax credit values, that can be challenging. And in fact, we've actually lost money on one of these deals recently. Special contracts, as I mentioned, with respect to the Middlebury College and the Glavel projects. I mean, these are great opportunities. They're very innovative, but we need reproducibility. We need to be able to scale a model. So outside of just one or two projects, that's not a great way to do business. Let's see. So you also asked us to opine around.
May I ask a quick question here?
Yeah, please.
So is there the Glavel and Middlebury innovative projects that you're talking about, is there a take-home lesson from them that could be turned into a policy or an opportunity so that it was replicable on a predictable basis?
Yes, and I think I don't want to speak for Green Mountain Power, but I think if you spoke to them, they would welcome the opportunity to make this more of a standard, like a tariff, as opposed to a special contract.
Okay.
But it's innovative in that they're and the PUC agreed on this in an order approving that special contract, that there was no ratepayer impact to this model. And the benefit of the model is it cleaves off the RECs and allows the customer to essentially get title to the RECs, which allows them to make the claims around decarbonization and clean energy.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So moving on here. So how can we so I guess under the sort of banner of how do we address tier 2 and energy burden and social inequity and sustain the state's workers, I have a number of comments here. I do believe that we need to at least increase tier 2 to a doubling at a minimum. This will increase local energy resiliency and prepare for a future that's going to be dominated by distributed inverter-based generation resources coupled with storage. But we need lower cost tools to be able to do so. So we can make the argument that we're doing so in the most cost-effective manner possible. I do believe we need to provide avenues for low and moderate income folks, and that the community solar element of this bill is strong in that regard. And I really do believe that we really need to sustain and improve and capitalize on the clean energy economy. This could be a cornerstone for the future Vermont economy in the 21st century. Young Vermonters' interest in the climate emergency is intense. I mean, I have read a number of thoughtful pieces by concerned and sometimes even scared younger Vermonters, fearful that the adults in the room and in state capitals and in DC are not moving fast enough, considering the impact on their future lives of the decisions that we are making today. And I firmly believe that we can either help create the jobs that they want, or we can watch them leave for markets that do. So the last, I guess it's not the last, the third thing you asked us to address was ownership of these assets, financeability, what opportunities are there for developers to lead on renewable energy generation. So under this overall sort of topic, I think, it is true that some assets could and will continue to be owned by utilities. And in fact, we've supported a few of these projects over the past 10 years. But I firmly believe that Vermont needs a vibrant, clean energy market supported by innovative private sector companies who have access to low cost of capital so that we can move fast enough to benefit from the economic potential of the energy transition while doing our part to respond to the climate crisis. I think it's also important to recognize that Green Mountain Power is the only utility in Vermont with an appetite for the tax credits that are and will continue to be the cornerstone of the capital stack required to bring these projects to life. And in order to do so at the lowest the most competitive costs possible. And finally, renewable energy project development is fraught with risk, from concept all the way to commissioning, and subjecting ratepayers to that risk that we in the development community have learned to navigate would just, in my mind, not seem to be the best use of utility resources. Again, unfortunately, outside of the net metering program, and in a scenario where the standard offer goes away, even if it was somewhat limited in scale, there are not many opportunities for the private sector to lead on renewable deployment, which is why we've had to find opportunities in other markets to, continue our business, quite frankly. With respect to the question about scale definitely helps with offtake and therefore, PPA pricing. If we want to deliver lowest cost renewables, we need much more scale than just 500 kilowatts. The Middlebury project, the PPA rate there was below the 9-cent bogey that I think I heard Ms. Bailey testify to as the value of solar for VIPSA last week. It's 8.5 cents. We can achieve those price points, but we need scale. And finally, and this is kind of the most exciting thing for me to sort of comment on, which is kind of the look forward. You had asked us, let's also think about where we are now and where we want to be in 5 and 10 years. And I think that's probably the most important question that was asked here. So with respect to that and some context, the 2020s have commonly been referred to the decade of disruption. We're going to see massive amounts of disruption in the energy sector over the next 10 years. I would argue that the last decade was also a decade of disruption and really got the wheels turning. But I think profound changes are here and they're going to continue. Here are a few examples, some statistics, some numbers. For solar, panels were $2.50 per watt when Encore did our first project in 2010. That pricing is now in the low to mid 30-cent range. So that's an 80% decline in price between 2010 and 2020, with another 70% price decline predicted for the next decade ahead, 2020 to 2030. Wind, 40% reduction in, sure.
Senator McDonald?
Just thank you for the measurement of the reduction in price of panels. Their efficiency per panel, do you have a commensurate number?
Sure. Those panels in 2010 were 230 watts per panel, like 3x5 panel. We are now buying panels that are over 400 watts. So
that's, I guess, 7 to 1 multiplied by what, 4? Anyway, you're getting more panels for $1, and you're getting more out of each panel
yes,
per square inch.
Yeah, 80% less cost for the panel that is now producing 40 to 50% more per panel.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So yeah, wind, 40% reduction in cost 2010 to 2020, and another 40% reduction predicted for 2020 to 2030. Now here's where it really gets interesting. Lithium-ion batteries, which are only one element of the energy storage market, but they are the biggest one and the one that's kind of made the most headway to date. We've seen a 90% decline in pricing from 2010 to 2020, and we're projecting to see another 80% decline in pricing between 2020 and 2030. So, we're going to continue to see cost efficiencies for solar, wind, and battery storage. Further, these generation resources have zero future fuel cost, not just future fuel cost risk, just zero future fuel cost. These plants, you build them, they produce electricity from now until you decommission them. So extreme, tremendous cost declines. But at the same time, transmission costs are actually increasing. And so I would charge the committee to think about a point in the future, and I don't know when it's going to be, at the end of the 2020s, maybe sometime in the 2030s, when distributed generation could actually be cheaper than transmitting the power coming in. That's where it's going. I think, some other elements to be considering moving forward here, and I think Mr. Bender touched on this, as have others. Our load is going to be going up, primarily driven by electrification of our thermal and our transportation sectors. So EVs and heat pumps. The capital markets are engaged here, and we're starting to see third-party financed rollout of heat pumps and EV fleets using financing models that sort of came out of the last decade, where we began to use power purchase agreements for renewables, with utilities. So I think we're going to continue to see extreme interest in this segment of the market from the capital markets. And therefore, I view the projections that are out there on EV and heat pump adoption to be really low. And I think we need to be ready for a massive explosion in both of those segments of the market. And then finally,
a quick question on transmission.
yes, please.
Is this because regions of the Northeast that consume far more energy than their renewable energy than they can generate? So assuming the increasing shift to renewables from fossil fuels, are they going to need to be net importers of that renewable energy? And so there's expensive shared infrastructure to be built, and that's the driver of transmission costs that you're talking about?
Yes, it's largely that, Senator. And then it's also just, steel and wires are still going to be subject to inflationary price pressures. And, that's not to say that solar panels and batteries are not as well, but they are newer technologies that still have more headroom in terms of their pricing. So it's just a more, transmission is just a more mature, segment of the space.
Okay, thank you.
And I did want to touch on energy storage, right? I think some people in the space refer to energy storage as the bacon of energy. I like to say in Vermont, it's the kale of energy, and that it just makes everything better. It helps to smooth out the generation profile of these inverter-based generation technologies, such as solar and wind, which is going to increasingly provide more and more energy security for Vermonters. And a good example of this is the larger scale project that GMP announced in Panton. I believe Mr. Cassingue referenced this in his testimony last week, where they're essentially creating an island. They're essentially able to wall off that circuit in the event of an emergency that would knock down transmission lines, such as what we saw in the ice storm of '98. I realize that's going back a number of years, but recall at that point, transmission from Quebec was all but out. Storage provides an opportunity for energy resiliency at both the home scale as well as the grid scale. So I guess moving towards my concluding thoughts here, given the trends in renewable energy pricing and the need for climate resilience, and in order to fully embrace a decarbonized future for our transportation and thermal needs, Vermont really has got to look beyond our ski tips on our energy future. In my mind, it's a lot like riding a bike or skiing. If you look down at your feet, you're going to crash. You've got to look ahead. And I think on energy, the analogy stands pretty strong. We've got to look ahead to where we want to go and take strides to get there now. So I would respectfully ask that you all urgently look ahead 5, 10, 15 years from now and act quickly to get us on a path for a more resilient energy distribution system, one that is more compatible with bidirectional flow of electrons, and one that is supported by storage to address the shifting daily and seasonal load patterns. We will have to upgrade the grid, and you know, it's interesting right now, it feels like we have a once in a generation opportunity to secure federal infrastructure funding to help mitigate some of those costs and hopefully get us beyond the who pays conundrum. You know, is it all the developer? Is it all going to be on the backs of the developers, or is it all going to be on the backs of the ratepayers? Well, hopefully there's a middle ground, and I think this federal funding opportunity could really play a pivotal role in reducing that pressure. And finally, and in conclusion, I believe I touched on this earlier, but I really believe that we need to regain our early mover advantages in the clean energy market as a tool for not only energy resilience and security in the future, but also for job creation and economic opportunity for Vermonters of all ages, but perhaps especially the younger generations among us who are passionate about responding to the climate crisis, and will have a greater impact on them than folks my age and older. I can't tell you how many amazingly well-qualified, smart, and passionate young folks respond to any and all job postings we put out there. They want to be part of the solution and are focused on fixing the climate that has been wrecked, quite frankly, by more than 50 years of short-sighted policy that only focuses on the single bottom line. You know, so I think if we want to continue to engage, attract, and retain those folks in the Vermont economy, we absolutely need to cultivate a robust clean energy economy. And this bill, in my view, with additional legislation, perhaps further enabling energy storage deployment in Vermont, provides another avenue for that work, another tool for the toolbox, and another opportunity to build on our successes of the last decade and move forward towards our now legislatively mandated clean energy goals. So with that, I would just say thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with the committee this morning, and I'd be more than happy to respond to questions this morning or at any time moving forward. Thanks again.
Thank you for coming in and working with us yet again. It's always great to have, as I say, folks from the field showing up to help us vet policy ideas. Senator McDonald, do you have a
same questions? We're learning more and more about the details of the problem we're trying to solve, but we would like the witnesses to focus on a few concrete solutions or directions we ought to go in. How do you make the sun shine at night? How do you get local electricity out to the close areas instead of, you know, which is 10 times as expensive as getting far away electricity to us, which we pay a much smaller share for. How do we do that, and how do we fund it when our opponents are, hollering cost shift and clever anti-marketing devices for what we're trying to do? How should we change Vermont policy and law to achieve the goals that the witnesses are coming in supporting?
Yep. So I look, storage is huge. I really think we've got to have some, and maybe it's in this bill or another bill, but we've got to have some milestones in the near future for storage deployment.
We have truckloads of milestones. We don't have the people to walk from one to we don't know how to walk from one to another.
Yep. Well, it's a market signal, right? And if we put the market signals out there, the investment will come, and it'll come, quickly enough. So I really think we need some storage goals, mandates, whatever we want to call them. That'll help get the sun to shine at night. And I think it's not just short duration storage. We need to incentivize some longer duration storage, things that'll go 12 hours and greater. I think Mr. Bender talked about the use of EVs for that. I think, Green Mountain Power has been fairly innovative there. We need to continue that work. Let's see. Look, I think we also need to, and this is tricky, but we also need to acknowledge that low cost power that's just the price of the power, right? then we still have to pay for additional capacity. We still have to pay for additional transmission. You know, we should value the RECs. We should value the RECs appropriately, right? And that gets to the greenwashing component. Yeah.
Well, you know, we write us a bill on how to achieve those things, or at least that's what we need. That's, you know more about it than we do. We're hearing what's wrong with it. We agree. What do we put in its place?
Yeah. And look, and again, I think that last question that you asked the committee, like, how should we be thinking about things 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now? I mean, it takes 4 years to move some of these projects forward. So we're already thinking about 5 years down the road today. So I think we really need to vision a world where solar and wind paired with battery storage outcompetes on price these other imported energy technologies. And
Mr. Chair, I'm just we need to help in the solution. And the witness brought up 4 years, and whenever I hear 4 years, I say World War II involvement began and ended with victory in less than 4 years. We need answers with that sort of aggressiveness, and we need them now. Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, and I appreciate all the contributions I'm hearing. This is really kicking off a conversation. We're not trying to get to signing legislation yet, but we do need, the rubber does need to hit the road, as Senator McDonald, I think, is urging us to get there. So with that, not seeing any other committee questions. Thanks, Mr. Farrell. And I'd like to go on to Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Senator Ray. Good morning. For the record, Ben Edgerly Walsh. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Director for VPIRG, or the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. I appreciate the opportunity to come in and testify this morning, and I will start with speaking to some of the questions that we received from the committee, and certainly we'll touch on some of the questions that Senator McDonald has been raising with every witness as well. So the way, kind of broadly, I read the questions that I received from the committee is, what are we trying to solve for? You write different legislation, you aim at different things if you're trying to solve different problems. And so while I think all of the things that have been laid out, jobs in the renewable energy sector that have been waning in recent years, energy affordability, that all the things that were laid out are things that we should be designing policy to advance. That being said, I want to focus on a couple of them here today. One, we need more renewable energy than we are currently on pace to build, more renewable electricity, and we need it here in Vermont. Two, we need to stop leaving Vermonters behind in this transition to a clean energy economy. And three, we do need to do a better job at moving towards resilience and advancing energy storage. Let me touch on that last one first, just briefly. And I will have a couple of thoughts on potential policy avenues on that. A lot of what I would say about that has already been said. A couple of additional points that I make. One, no one is suggesting that Vermont should be an island. We saw how that worked out for Texas. They are the only state in the country that is, in fact, other than I suppose Hawaii, an island as far as their electric grid goes. And that is a precarious place to be in. It is also a precarious place to be in, being very heavily reliant on a handful of large sources with a handful of bottlenecks. And that is, to a degree, the position Vermont finds itself in today. And so by building a lot more renewable energy here in Vermont and pairing it with substantial amounts of energy storage, to Mr. Farrell's point, at different time scales, storage that can move energy around over the course of a day and over the course of longer timeframes, would make Vermont more resilient And that is something that we should all be thinking about as we are heading into a place that will be disruptive from an energy standpoint, as Mr. Farrell said, but also because we are going to see, no matter whatever anyone does, more significant climate impacts in the years and decades to come. So getting out ahead of that, and that's something that is, under the Solutions Act that you all passed last year, something that is very deliberately part of the conversation, resilience. And that also, if doing that well, it doesn't just make Vermont more resilient, it also helps solve the how do we make the sunshine at night issue that you've been discussing, and it also helps address the efficiency of the system, efficiency of the grid. The more that we can be producing close to home, the better we are doing on that front. Let me next touch on the idea of additionality. That's something that Mr. Bender went into in a lot of detail, and I will stay at a high level on that, not needing to make the same points again. Essentially, at again a very high level, the way I look at this is the way VPIRG approaches this. This is right now we have in-state policy, 10% new renewables coming required, and 65%, because of course we're getting to that 75% total renewable electricity under the renewable energy standard, 65% renewables that are allowed to be existing renewables, and that's basically what's been filling that. And even if you say, okay, well let's go to 100, and that's something that some utilities are doing or have done, you're talking about a 90-10 mix of 90% existing renewables, 10% new renewables. Just as a thought experiment, if you zoom that policy out and said, okay, what if every state did that? What if that was a national policy? We're going to get to 100% renewable, but 90% of that renewable energy was going to be renewables that have already been built or already in the ground somewhere in the United States, or or deliverable to the United States. That would clearly not work as a policy because we don't have that much renewable electricity in North America. And to Mr. Bender's point, if we are, we are in a place where we can sort of pretend like we are meeting our renewable electricity targets with imported electricity primarily, because we are so small, because we are a small fraction even just of the ISO New England's grid. But at the end of the day, to address climate pollution, to reduce climate pollution, you need to build new things. We cannot solve the climate crisis with the resources that exist currently globally. And so it, to our mind, doesn't make sense to have a state policy that really tries to address Vermont's climate pollution primarily with out-of-state existing resources. Now, again, as with the Vermont is not an island, we're not saying 100% in-state, and no one really is credibly asking for that. That's also not where we're aiming at or where we should be aiming at. I don't think from VPIRG's standpoint it makes sense to cut off electricity imports. That's not even a goal that we should be aiming for. It does make sense to have a diversified grid, diversified set of energy sources. That means diversity geographically, diversity of size, diversity of type of renewable electricity, diversity of ownership or development model. Because with that diversity comes more reliability, more resilience, but where we need to be going is a policy that ultimately requires a lot more renewable electricity at a variety of scales than current policy does. That's a conversation that sort of got started last year, got short-circuited with the pandemic and the legislature going virtual. But it is one that we certainly hope to pick back up at some point. The last point I'll make on that is that to that diversity, we need a diversity of tools, and right now we are actually seeing a narrowing of the tools, the policy tools, the development tools that the state has at its disposal to get renewable electricity deployed. We're seeing the standard offer, as has been pointed out, going away. We're seeing net metering be constrained by the PUC's interpretation of the current renewable energy standard, and restrained in practical terms by the rates that they are setting as a result. And so where we need actually more tools at our disposal as a state to ultimately achieve our goals, we're actually seeing fewer available on the ground in Vermont. And so that's, one of the reasons that we're excited about a model like the one contemplated in S119, because it does fundamentally say, speak to that issue of the tools that we have available and try to create a new tool for the state to actually get renewables deployed. So that is definitely something that we're excited about, and a very, very positive development. And we're glad that this conversation is happening. So I'm going to shift to speaking a little bit about equity and access, and who is and is not part of this transition to the renewable energy future, the sort of new energy economy that we're seeing. And obviously that's something that goes far beyond just the traditional electric sector, and like literally who does and does not build solar, electric vehicles, cold climate heat pumps. There are a lot of other pieces of that, but for today, obviously, I'll focus on the renewable electricity piece. So in the bill as introduced on page 2, sub B, I think it's towards the top of the page, but I don't have the PDF in front of me. The bill states the purposes of the program are to encourage the use of renewable energy through the provision of bill credits for the production of such energy to all interested customers. And that phrase, all interested customers, rang a bell for me because it sounds a lot like what the legislature put in place in Act 99, which was the net metering law in 2014 that set in motion the current net metering system. And that one says, in part, of course, the rules shall establish and maintain a net metering program that, and of the many criteria, it says, ensures that all customers who want to participate in net metering have the opportunity to do so. The PUC has interpreted that provision. I know this because this is a point that we have attempted to make with the PUC over and over and over again. They have interpreted that to mean that they shouldn't literally make it illegal for any class of customers to net meter. And of course they haven't. But in practical terms, the net metering program, and by extension, development of renewable electricity, and a literal monetary and physical stake in our transition towards renewable electricity, is not actually available to all Vermonters who want to have the opportunity to participate in that transition. In particular, renters are basically being left out. Mr. Farrell spoke to the community renewable arrays that were really starting to get going under the former net metering policy. There were actually several dozen of those built and permitted in roughly the late 2015 period, and sort of built following that. So over the course of maybe a year, and I'm using very rough numbers here, we had several dozen arrays. We were actually at that moment a real national leader on this idea of virtual net metering, and how can we get people who, for whatever reason, and being a renter is one of the key reasons you couldn't put renewable energy in your own backyard or on your own roof, giving people who don't have that avenue on their own property the option to be part in a direct way of this renewable energy transition. We had really sort of cracked that nut. We had created a model that other states have since emulated and surpassed, and then that door was closed. The PUC, perhaps intentionally, perhaps unintentionally, but in practical terms, closed the door to that kind of community renewable array that you could have off-takers from around the state participating in, and in particular, renters had the ability to participate in. And that's for a variety of reasons that you've heard over the past few days and other times, but the added complexity and cost of permitting, the lower rates, the preferred locations generally being more expensive to build on, though that was a construct that we supported for other reasons, land use in particular. And so now we're at a moment where there have been a couple of one-off models, an array here, an array there, that have allowed people who are not themselves homeowners to participate in this transition. But basically, there's nothing that's scalable anymore. And so that's a real problem from an equity standpoint. Vermonters who are renters are more likely to be low income. If I can share my screen briefly here. Jude, is that something you can open up for me? Well, let me make the point in the meantime, and maybe you'll be able to share the slide in a moment. The Vermont Housing Finance Administration and the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment has looked at this issue of income as it relates to being a renter, being a homeowner. And you have, in rough terms, something like 3/4 of renters being below median income. Median meaning the middle, right? So obviously you have a significantly higher portion of renters who are low income than homeowners. And so by having an inherent functional barrier to renters participating in renewable electricity in a direct way, that is in a very real way an equity concern. It means that low income Vermonters do not have the same access to renewable electricity that their homeowning counterparts do. And that's even setting aside, obviously, the sort of more inherent barriers that come just from literally, having less income to devote to this kind of project. The other thing that comes with that, in particular here in Vermont, lack of access to renters is a real racial disparity. Again, this is using Vermont Housing Finance Agency data. Right now in Vermont, you have roughly 1 in 5 Black Vermont households owning their own home, and about 70% of Vermonters, 70% of, white Vermonters own their own home. And I've heard, I've made this point about Vermonters who are renters not having full access to this renewable energy transition in the past, in testimony here and elsewhere. And I've had other folks who've testified after me make the point that, oh, well, that's actually not really true, because everyone's actually part of this transition to renewable electricity, because everyone takes power from the grid, everyone's a customer of a Vermont utility, and Vermont utilities and the Vermont grid is getting greener, is getting more renewable. And I hear that and respect it, and literally, financial or physical way, being part of a renewable energy development is not going to be the path that every single Vermonter takes towards participating in this transition. However, when we have a system where you have 3 out of 4 white Vermonters actually directly able to participate, setting aside perhaps they have a slate roof, perhaps their neighbor has trees, but potentially participating as a homeowner, 3 out of 4 white Vermonters and 1 out of 4 Black Vermonters, that's a problem. That's a problem, even if everyone is part of the same grid. So let me speak briefly to this issue of community solar, and then I want to shift to policy tools, a couple of closing points, and then obviously would love to field any questions you all have.
Can I ask a quick question before we leave the equity?
Of course,
piece?
please.
So in service territories like Burlington, Washington Electric, Swanton Electric, everyone is getting, maybe there'll be some quibbling over definitions of renewable energy, but they're 100% renewable. So does that seem like a viable alternative to the 1-by-1 solution when you work at the household level? I mean, how do you compare the desirability of one versus the other?
Compare the desirability of a grid that's 100% renewable versus like literally individual homeowners or customers being able to go renewable.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would say to that is, I think that the issue of definitions is actually very important. I don't want to dwell too much on that concept of additionality, but it is actually, I think it needs to be central to this conversation, because if we actually are going to get out of this climate crisis, the transition requires more than just signing contracts for power that's already in the ground. I've made that point already, but it is relevant to that, and I actually do think that is not unimportant. The other point is there are other benefits that flow from being able to directly participate in developing renewable energy. There are financial benefits to the household that right now are more available to upper income versus lower income, white versus black Vermonters. That's a problem. And then, frankly, there's I don't know what to call it exactly, but a sort of a moral or just like literally having a stake in this transition. That is something that there are many people in Vermont that want, and they can do that a whole bunch of different ways. They can get an electric vehicle, they can drive more slowly on the highway, there's a million opportunities to do that. But from where we're standing, at least at VPIRG, one of the important ways that we have as a state decided that Vermonters should be able to access is putting solar on your own home, or other words, going renewable. And if we're doing that as a state, I think it is important that we are doing it in a way that is accessible to Vermonters at large, regardless of their race or income. And I want to be clear, I do not believe that the Public Utilities Commission has in any way intentionally created a program that is less accessible to low income or Black or other Vermonters of color. But that is actually functionally what has happened. And that direct one-to-one participation, as you put it, I think actually is an important piece of the puzzle.
Okay, thank you.
So let me actually just speak to the bill briefly that we're here to talk about. The kind of model that S119 presents, I think, is actually a really exciting opportunity to start to solve some of these problems and reopen that door to community energy and to renters, and everything else that I was just talking about, because it says, as a state policy, we have this 5 megawatt line for the renewable energy standard. That 10% is up to 5 megawatts per system, right? And for net metering, we have created this artificial cap of 500 kilowatts, and there's all sorts of potentially good reasons for that. But if we actually want the lowest cost community energy, allowing larger systems into the mix is obviously one way to do that without changing anything else. And there are other things that could be changed about permitting and all that, but without changing anything else, economies of scale being what they are, you're going to get lower cost renewable electricity if you're allowing larger systems into the mix. And right now we have in Vermont, we've got small systems through net metering. This kind of medium-sized system is really only something that utilities are able to do, either directly or indirectly. And then larger systems are just totally out. Like, we're not building anything like that really anymore, other than the imports that we're talking about.
Okay.
So let me touch on some policy tools briefly. And let me just say, this is not sort of a quote unquote VPIRG proposal or anything like that. This is just some options that you can consider as you're trying to address the questions that I raised, the questions you raised to all the witnesses, and the questions that Senator McDonald, you've been bringing up. One on community renewables, just to restate, something like this is a good idea, is something that the state should be pursuing. I would add that some kind of a targeted low and moderate income component of it, whether that's an adder or something else, would make sense to very directly get at that access thing, rather than just access and the ability to actually participate are actually two different things, and addressing both of them in a bill like this, I think, would be important. I absolutely agree that tier 2 needs to be expanded. Doing this kind of bill without expanding tier 2 is going to change where the renewables are built and change who's building some of the renewables, but it's not actually going to get more renewables built ultimately, because the PUC has interpreted that tier 2 level as a hard cap on renewable development. On storage, Senator McDonald, to your question of what are the policy avenues there, something like a procurement standard or a mandate for a certain pace of deployment of renewable energy, storage and storage linked to renewable energy in particular, is definitely an avenue that a lot of other states have been pursuing with some success. And it's something that Vermont should consider rather than just leaving it entirely up to the utilities in the private market. There's a role for policy to play there. Similarly, tier 3 of the renewable energy standard, storage is sort of playing in that space to a degree, but if there's a real intent to accelerate the pace of deployment of storage, some sort of a storage specific policy like tier 3 could make sense, or an expansion of tier 3, recognizing that storage is going to play a larger and larger role as the future unfolds and as that policy expands, as it does under the current renewable energy standard. So let me just say a couple last things and I'll wrap, and happy to answer any other questions you have. So I think this point has been made, but I do think it bears repeating. The foresight that this committee and the Vermont legislature broadly has had on renewable electricity has put us in a good position as a state to build into the next decade. You've created tools that were innovative in their time and built a really important foundation of renewable energy industry in this state that is, at times has been nation leading and is certainly still very robust and in a position to, really expand substantially if the right policy tools are passed. That is an incredibly important thing to recognize. We're in a moment really to build on that. Mr. Farrell brought up the federal money. Obviously, there's a lot of stimulus dollars already out there. Just this morning, or perhaps it was late last night, the White House released their outline for a $2.25 trillion infrastructure bill. That certainly speaks to a lot of these issues. And I am really quite interested in seeing some of the details of that, and excited to see this committee dig into the renewable energy components of that the states are going to ultimately have access to if it does pass. I also want to say, though, that the window for building on the foundation that you created as a legislature, in our view, is closing, right? Like, we do have a renewable energy sector, in particular the solar sector, that's been contracting. There are fewer jobs in that space. There are fewer people to do that work. Just like we saw in ARA back in around 2010, there was a real influx of cash on low-income weatherization. The workforce was trained up. People got jobs. People learned how to do that work. The money went away. They lost their jobs, and we didn't actually retain the capacity that we had developed through, at that time, federal dollars. But there's an analog here going on in the renewable space. I absolutely think we're still in a moment where you can build on that foundation, but it isn't going to last forever. So I'm really excited to see this conversation happening now. And I think that a bill like this could be a really key piece of building on that foundation. So I deeply appreciate the opportunity to come in and testify on this. Certainly looking forward to this conversation continuing, and happy to take any questions you have.
Looking to see if there are committee questions for Mr. Walsh right now. All right.
Help us write a bill.
This committee hasn't been working much from paper, so we're eager to see something on paper. You can tell, Mr. Chair.
119 is on paper.
Well, I think we're looking for something maybe even a little more specific. I'm hearing from Senator McDonald. Maybe
all right.
I bet Mr. Walsh can help us.
We will get to work on that. I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, any language, anything like that would be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely.
Senator McCormick, then Senator McDonald.
Yeah, you talk about the loss of capacity. Do you think the influx, do you think change of policy in Washington is going to be any help to us? Should we be ready to use that? And if so, how?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that $2.25 trillion and Vermont's portion of that is a big deal. That's absolutely without question. I do think that it makes sense for policy committees to be digging into that. I've only had a chance to skim what the White House has put out. It's still very vague in places, but starting that conversation as soon as possible. I think obviously there's going to be a lot of money that's going to states and large grants that the states can decide what to do with with the stimulus dollars. I wouldn't be surprised if there are also more competitive grant programs like we saw in ARA. And so the states that are sort of the best position have started the conversation sooner rather than later on that, are going to be, I think, better positioned to take advantage of that. I'd say, one thing that I'm going to be spending some time on is thinking about, what are the things that Vermont has done really well that we could build on. The Clean Energy Development Fund, for instance, is one place that has had a history of sort of spooling up to meet the moment, and might be a place for some of these dollars to live and be effective. So what are the various, and this goes way beyond just renewable electricity, obviously, but what are the various things that could be built on and are a little bit more sort of shovel ready or turnkey, as it will. And then on the capacity thing, it is, it's interesting to be having the weatherization conversation right now as well. And what we're, hearing in that space is like, oh, we don't have the workforce. And
Yeah.
right, and then we did a decade ago, we had the workforce, and we don't anymore. And that's because we didn't continue to invest in a state. We had an opportunity to, stay at that higher RO level and did not find the funding for that. And now we're, seeing it in our ability to ramp up more slowly than we'd like to meet this new level of funding. So ultimately, on renewables and other places, figuring out how to keep at a higher level after the federal funding goes. And I know that's a conversation this committee has already, started and it's well underway, but just to underscore the importance of that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Senator McDonald.
The witnesses suggested the PUC is headed in the wrong direction, is misinterpreting or perhaps misguided. Could we get some specific language suggestions to help them get back, the PUC to get back on track?
Yes, that is absolutely something. Again.
Suggest how we modify our instructions to the PUC. Thank you.
Understood.
Great. So committee, once again, obviously there's a real appetite for discussion on this because we're running long. We're going to reschedule the introduction of House Bill 108. We'll take a break for 10 minutes because we have been going straight 2 hours, which is not so great for any of us, and then come back and finish with our 3 remaining witnesses. So